Well, a very good afternoon, everybody, and a huge apology for the fact that it's 12:42 and we aren't started yet. Thank you for your patience. We have the organizer's nightmare, which is that we have our speaker, but we do not have him on screen at the moment. So we are working in the background, and I'm hoping and very hopeful that we're going to get him on one way or another. So with your agreement, I'm going to carry on as if David Leeder was actually here and on screen, and to say a warm welcome to this, which is the first of a series of 6 lunchtime masterclasses that we're putting on with the support of Landor Conferences. And we, of course, is BRT UK, Bus Rapid Transit UK, not-for-profit company that exists to promote the best ideas and good practice generally across the bus industry. It's been around since the mid-noughties, and of course our main event has been an annual conference. That's not possible at the moment, so we hit upon the idea of these lunchtime sessions. My name, of course, is James Freeman, and I am the recently retired MD of First West of England, now freelancing, and it's my pleasure to chair this afternoon's session. Now we have David Leeder coming on, I hope, and then I do hope, and then we have a range of speakers over the next 6 weeks. The full details you can find on Transport Extra or in Local Transport Today. David Leeder is managing partner of TIL Investments Limited, and his talk to start our series today is about funding in the bus industry, and he's entitled it Bus Revolution. David is the founder of TIL Transport Investment Limited and has held senior roles in the bus and rail industry since 1985. He's an economist and strategy consultant, and he's held operational, CEO, and commercial roles in a variety of passenger transport organizations, beginning his career with BR and, of course, the bus privatization pioneer Transit Holdings, where he was assistant to the inimitable Harry Blundred. Prior to co-founding TIL, he was a main board director of First Group PLC and an executive director of National Express Group PLC, and he was also CEO of West Midlands Travel, which is where I first met him and worked for him as the UK's largest regional bus operator outside London. He has acted as non-executive director or chairman of Greyhound Lines USA, Heathrow Express, Midland Metro, and GB Rail Freight. He is a past president of the Confederation of Passenger Transport, the CPT, and has spent 11 years as an advisor to the UK Department for Transport. TIL has a wide client base across the operating industry and government at home and abroad. Now, David's talk is divided into 4 sections, and we will break after each section for a few minutes to take comments and questions from you, the audience, through the chat, which you'll need to submit through the chat. Even more than ever, we'll need you to be brief and to the point, as we only have until 1:30, though we might allow ourselves a little bit extra since we are a quarter of an hour behind schedule as we speak. So I am now hoping that there is news of David Leeder. Let's ask. And
hello, James. Can you hear me?
I can, David.
Very good.
Never was I
Thank you.
More welcome to be heard. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me hand over to David, and away you go.
Thanks, James. I'll move through this briskly, and you've introduced the company. So if we move on to the slide 3, please, which shows the 4 issues on the screen. So you'll remember, ladies and gentlemen, that the dinosaurs were wiped out by a meteorite. Now, I'm going to contend this lunchtime that the industry faces 4 meteorites. The first one is the changes in demand that predate COVID, but have been accelerated by COVID. The second one is net zero, which we expect to be mainly electrification. The third one are the consequences of devolution of policy control to metro mayors, the home nations, and regional government. And the fourth and final one is the economic re-regulation of bus services. So next slide, please, as Chris Whitty would say. So on to the post-COVID demand changes. I think the first thing to say is that the demand change in aggregate is very large by historic standards. Obviously, there is a reduction in daily commuting, trip frequency, but we are also seeing secondary effects. For example, a movement of population to suburbs and smaller towns and different travel within those areas. The second change I call bricks to clicks, so that's the loss of town centre retail trips, but also the loss of town centre retail jobs. A lot of the commuting journeys on buses were retail related. The third topic I've called LTNs and cycle policy. There are several current and new elite consensuses. One of them is about the desirability of cycling. Now, this is leading in places where the policy has been implemented to very dramatic worsening of bus journey speeds. And that has very big consequences for costs and for bus revenues. And the fourth post-COVID demand change is decentralization. The decentralization of office and retail activity to locations where the car can be expected to have a high share and the bus a minimal share. And that doesn't necessarily mean out of town, that may even be edge of centre. That's a big effect as well. So next slide, please. Discussion point one. I can take, James, some comments or questions on that set of points.
Yes, David, thank you very much. Actually, what's interesting is that with the delay in starting, we haven't got any comments yet coming through the chat. So I have my suggestion would be to carry on at this point, and we'll pick up as we go on.
So if you move on to the next slide, please, which shows some nice buses. So electrification. The shift to electric vehicles is in itself a very large change, and it affects the entire supply chain of the bus industry and the economics. Now, if we look at it from an economic historical perspective, it is comparable to the elimination of horse vehicles in the 1910s. Prior to 1914, there were large listed companies which were all about horses, horse hospitals, delivering straw, removing manure and so on. These were major sources of economic activity, and they were completely gone by the end of the First World War. Similar change occurred in the 1930s with the elimination of trams. So this is the biggest technical change for 80 to 100 years, but it has very large economic and operational consequences. So if you move on to the next slide, I'll talk about some of those. So not only are we replacing oil with electric power, but we also have to think about a load of related issues. Battery finance, how are we going to pay for the batteries? The use of the buses and the batteries to store intermittent renewable power. This is very topical, but one way of thinking about buses is as a useful store of energy. If you can charge them at night with wind energy, you can discharge them during the day. The batteries will last for 5 to 8 years at the moment. We need to reuse the bus batteries. They won't be completely obsolete. They can't be used in buses, but they may be used to balance a grid load. So we can use the bus batteries in two ways: in the bus to balance the grid, and we can reuse old batteries in shipping containers to balance the grid. There are very likely to be different suppliers in the supply chain. For example, BYD has gained about 70% of the London bus market. We'd never heard of them 6 years ago. Some people that we consider giants of the bus industry, like Mercedes, could disappear from the market in a small number of years. And then asset lives. We've got to be very careful of the kind of George Clooney doctrine that says that I buy a new Tesla every few weeks to demonstrate my virtue. One of the things we know about electric vehicles is that they last a very long time. The batteries don't, but the battery life is increasing. So we probably need to think about keeping these electric vehicles much longer than the 15 or 20 years that we've kept diesel buses. That seems to us quite an important change, but with very big implications. And finally, engineering. Engineering will be completely different. Most of the people in the bus industry know about diesel vehicles. The skill set we need will be completely different. There will be a major need for retraining, and there will probably be some simplification and reduction of engineering costs. So we can maybe then move on to the next discussion break, James.
Thank you. That's yeah. That now, of course, people's minds are moving, and we're starting to get some questions coming through. So one of them is, what evidence do we have that cycling is slowing down buses? Increasing cycling is also a government target. Surely it's private cars that need to be restricted, not cycles.
Well, we've got quite a lot of evidence of that. If we look at the London bus network, and I'll show some data later on, I think we've got to be clear here. I'm not for or against cycling, and I'm not actually for or against buses. I suppose what I'm trying to say here is there are two trade-offs that we need to manage in a very conscious manner. One is the scarcity of funding, something I'll talk about in later slides. In other words, there's not enough money for all the things that we want to spend money on. And the second one is the scarcity of road space. And you can see in the London bus network this effect very clearly, and I will maybe just sort of preview what I'm going to say later on. The way that I would think about this is there are two, you've got to imagine a seesaw, and one side of the seesaw are what I call exogenous economics. So this is things like population growth, difficulty of car parking, employment growth. And in London, and this isn't true in all cities by any means, those are very positive. So all things being equal, we would expect bus demand in London to be going up by 2 or 3% per annum. Bus demand in London pre-COVID was going down by much more than that, and that trend has only accelerated. And the difference between those numbers, it isn't 3%, it's sort of 6 or 7%. That is the effect of journey time reduction. Now, I think I agree with the hypothesis of the question, which to me seems to suggest that there need to be some balance or trade-offs here. It is perfectly reasonable from a public policy point of view to say that cycling is the kind of pyramid, the pinnacle of the virtue hierarchy, and that everything else is subservient to that. That's a perfectly reasonable position, which I personally don't share, but it is a reasonable position. But what you've then got to do is then decide, well, what is the role of the residual bus network? Is it simply for people who can't or won't cycle and can't or won't go in the underground or the tram or whatever that is? And that seems to me, by subtraction, to be the position that they're reaching in London. It's not clear to me that there is an omnibus type policy in London anymore in which the bus is seen as being a kind of generalized form of transport. It's by subtraction becoming some kind of residual mode of transport that's really there to deal with certain segments who don't fit into the rail or walking, cycling boxes. And the consequence of that will be it will be very expensive to provide. It will probably shrink, as the London bus network is shrinking rather rapidly at the moment. And thirdly, you might decide, particularly in smaller cities, that you carry most of that residual demand on Uber type services. You don't really have a general bus network. I was in Chesterfield yesterday morning, and I came to the conclusion that in a few years there wouldn't be any buses in Chesterfield, not in that case because of the cycle policies, but because the exogenous economics are so poor. So I think the point about London is, even with very positive exogenous economics, you can kill the bus network off if the journey speed drops to walking speed or below walking speed, which is where we are in many parts of London.
Yes, right. Thank you very much. There's been quite a lot of questions around that topic, but I'm going to leave it and move on to talk about your part 2 section, David, if that's all right.
Of course.
One of the questions which was an interesting one to me was, does the electric bus mean that the end of trams as a potential rail, if you like, as a potential method?
Yes, I was also on the Sheffield Supertram yesterday, and if you go on the Sheffield Supertram and it goes up very steep gradients in an enormous vehicle carrying in some cases not many people, the energy consumed per passenger will be very high, probably higher than a bus. So I'm actually an advocate of trams, but I think you have to have a very clear view of what niche are they intended to fill. I think trams can be highly effective if they are providing, as it were, heavy rail type capacity at less than heavy rail cost. And there's a great deal of work to do. It will be a very interesting separate discussion about how we bring tram costs down to something at a sensible level. But trams are not generally effective if they're being used to do the work of a single deck bus or even a double deck bus. But and one of the myths about trams is that they don't cause pollution. Of course, all that electricity that the Sheffield trams were using yesterday is being generated by some means or other, and it will vary day to day according to what the energy mix is. So I don't sort of suggest that there's no role for trams. I think there's a good role for trams, but it's probably to do something, as it were, cleverer with urban rail networks that don't carry many people. And a good example would be the Altrincham to Bury line in Manchester that was turned from a sort of middle-ranking railway to a successful tram line. But if you go to the on the Eccles line in Manchester, you could die of loneliness if you travel on that line. And there are several other lines around the country that have been built that have this ghostly feature. But surely, yes, the move to electric vehicles is beneficial. Just as a few numbers on this, our work suggests that the capital costs are 2 to 3 times higher with electric vehicles at the moment on a like-for-like basis. But the whole life cost may be in line with diesel if you can get the details right, particularly if you can get the asset life longer, you can get the maintenance cost down, you might start to get to parity with diesel. Now, electric vehicles in themselves will not generate any extra passengers, or certainly a very small number of extra passengers. But I think if you could link them to bus priority measures, which I think is a nice political combination, give something to everyone, that's when you'd get passenger growth and cost reduction, and that's when we move from the grim world to the sort of broad sunlit uplands of improved outcomes.
Thank you. And on the issue of alternative fuels, i.e., it's not just electric. Do you see a role for other ways?
I'm sure that there will be experiments with other things, including hydrogen fuel cells. The work that I think what I would say about electric is the first fleet of battery electric buses in London was taken out of service in 1910. And that wasn't because the electric vehicles weren't successful. It was because the battery technology wasn't adequate to the vehicles. We had a large fleet, almost 2,000 trolley buses in London. Many other places had them as well, between the 1930s and 1970s. So there's nothing new or experimental about electric vehicles. They're a rather proven technology. What is new is the battery. The hydrogen fuel cell vehicle is fundamentally riskier. As an economist and not an engineer, it seems to me fundamentally less efficient, because you've effectively got a power station that you're taking around. You've actually got to make the hydrogen. That's very technically an energy consuming activity. You then have a power station on the bus that generates electricity, and then it's an electric bus that actually makes the wheels go around. So it seems to me that if we can get the battery technology and the charging strategy to work better, electric buses feel like a lower risk option. But I'm sure there will be experiments with hydrogen fuel cell. They certainly address some of the range issues which limit what you can do with electric buses. But I think, yes, I mean, I'm not at all saying they're the only solution, but they feel like a lower risk solution because they basically combine a very proven technology, electric motors that were developed in the 1870s, with a new technology, batteries, which were developed in the last 10 years for iPhones.
Well, this is a topic that we shall return to in a future masterclass, a lot more around the technologies. So it's an interesting subject. Now, quite a lot of the questions that are coming in through the chat are actually relevant to things you're going to say. So I think it would be sensible, David, to carry on with part 3, and that will answer some of these and also make them even more relevant in the subsequent discussion. So over to part 3 then, please.
Please, yeah. So the next group of comments really are about devolution, and the picture on the top left, for those of you like me of an American persuasion, is the Boston Tea Party, and that was all about the conflict about taxation without representation. UK local government is generally the opposite of that, or is to some extent the opposite of that. In other words, it is representation without taxation. And it's entirely rational for elected mayors to propose very large spending plans that they hope and expect will be funded by central government grants and subsidies. And if you look at the big transport projects around the UK since the 1970s, really, that's how they've been funded. Somebody, Dennis Healey or Rishi Sunak, has come along and given out free money to local government. Now, this also means that local elected officials will tend to want to avoid policies that are locally unpopular. So this is where we come back to problems with things like bus lanes. They don't cost very much. They may generate very large benefits, but they may upset a lot of people. And it's also notable, I think, that if you look at something like the TfGM bus plan, it doesn't actually assume any growth in bus traffic. And that's presumably because pro-bus policies would be too unpopular. Now, this is not a party political issue. It's inherent in the way that the metro mayors and the devolved assemblies are funded. But I think the big negative on this is that we will hit limits on what central government can afford. And I don't expect many or all of the elected mayors to propose large local tax rises to pay for their spending plans. They're likely to go in the first instance to Rishi Sunak, and Rishi Sunak is likely to find, if he doesn't know already, that the cupboard is bare. So we can move on to the next slide. The other aspect, I think, of this is a change in the way that we think about local public transport. There's a very big shift going on at the moment from what I would call 1980s thinking to something that looks more like the 1950s or 1960s. So there's a belief in planning, that's back in fashion. And I think there's going to be a necessity for bus operators to orientate themselves to local politics. And they'll have to do this whether they like it or not. And certainly those that survive and those that thrive, in my view, will need to become much more closely aligned to local political structures. The regulatory structure that may emerge, people keep talking about London, but I think it's going to look more like the Netherlands or Sweden than London. And I can say more about that. But there's a general sense, as Peter Jay's father said, that sometimes the man from the ministry really does know best. And that might equally be applied to the man from or woman from the local authority. So we go on to the next slide. I've set out 4 regulatory futures that are possible for the bus industry. The first one I call no change or as is. And I think that is unlikely to work in most places because the revenue base is simply too weak post-COVID to make that work. The second one, partnership schemes or area schemes, enhanced partnerships, there's various names for them. This is as old as the hills. Brighton had one of these in 1939. I think Sheffield had one in the mid-1930s. They lasted into the 1980s. They're potentially very attractive for all parties if the structures, the economic structures are right, but they need a lot of thinking about it. And I can say more about that if people want. The third one that everyone leaps towards is London. And I'm going to argue in a minute that that no longer works because of the decay in bus speeds and the cost issues that arise from that. And then the fourth one, also under strain, I might add, is the Dutch-Swedish model of area contracts. And Manchester is proposing something that looked like that. I think the important point I'd like people to take away is the regulatory structures in themselves do not address the economic or financing issues. And I think there's a big misconception that the regulation solves the financing problems, which it doesn't. So we move on to the next slide, which is about London. For a long time, certainly since the late 1980s, people have tended to say, well, look, London bus demand is rising, London is regulated, so London is growing because of regulation. And this was always a terrible oversimplification. London demand is actually now falling quite sharply, even pre-COVID, and it's falling even more sharply post-COVID. And this is really, to recap what I said previously, this is despite the fact that London, compared to most other towns and cities, and certainly the bigger cities, has much more favourable economics, exogenous economics, than they do. So the impact of journey time reduction in London now exceeds the positive impact of the strong London economy, the difficulty of parking and so on. And here, where I'm sitting in Canary Wharf, about 4 weeks ago, the local bus network was chopped by about 30%. We're talking about removing many, many hundreds of buses from London. So we need to look at London, and I think even London will need to have a strategy, either to say it plans to have a very much smaller bus network because it's no longer a priority, or there needs to be a plan to get the kind of growth in London that we saw some time ago and some provincial cities have had. So maybe there, James, I'll pause for some more questions and comments.
Yes, and they are pouring in, so there's plenty to get at here. Going backwards a little bit and thinking about housing for a moment.
Yes.
Lots of new housing, as you know, is planned. What spatial layout on a regional scale would help bus networks be commercially viable without just relying on encouraging more people to do the travelling?
I think this is a really excellent question. It's something I was actually thinking about on my little expedition to the north over the last few days. So I would distinguish between two types of development, and they're both politically controversial. And again, we could have long conversations about them maybe in a future meeting. So one is what I would call the Faversham type situation, where you start building on the apple orchards and you're adding new districts to essentially small towns. Now, in those places, what should you do in terms of the spatial layout? I think you need to build simple, logical bus routes into the road layout, probably protected by bus gates. I think you had some of those in Reading, James, as I recall, going back a long time. But routes that enable buses to go in and out, and cycles and maybe other, obviously pedestrians, but enable efficient bus routes. The problem in the Faversham type places or the East Grinstead type places is that they may be too small for, in many cases, for buses to be successful, particularly if the office and retail activity is spread around the town and the pattern of travel is very complicated. And/or always a problem in the southeast, but probably a diminishing problem. Lots of the passengers are going to London every day to work, and that's obviously happening less often. The second issue is the expansion of, let's call them larger cities, where there is plenty of brownfield land. Example, Sheffield, where I've been the last couple of days. And in those places, again, I think the basic logic applies. People want simple, direct bus routes. And the watchword here is it has to be quicker and more reliable to make the journey by bus than to make the journey by car. If the journey is unreliable by bus and significantly slower, the car will win. And this is not just a question of the layout of the roads or the housing areas. It's also like the complexity of the trips. I made my money, I suppose, running minibuses in Exeter, and that had a classic starburst type city layout where everything happened in the city centre, and everyone, around the city centre were dormitory suburbs at quite high density, linked to the centre by direct bus routes. If you have a kind of many-to-many type matrix where people are driving to out-of-town office parks and going to the out-of-town next and so on, or even the edge of centre next, as they had in Chesterfield. If we went to the office, the retail park in Chesterfield, and we measured mode share, we would find even on the edge of the centre, there would be a de minimis bus share. So I think what we need to do is kind of plan simple routes into the road layout. This is where we can maybe resolve the conflict with cycles, because it can be designed in a way that, cycling and buses benefit. And then we stand some chance of getting high densities. But I think the point I'd like to finish on is public transport is only really able to serve high density attractor locations. So the more the town centre decays as an office location, an employment location, a retail location, the harder it will be for bus type public transport, let alone trams, let alone trains, to be successful. That you'll end up with an Uber type solution if everything is spread over the urban form, whether it's in Faversham or the outskirts of Sheffield. The more we can concentrate activity, and people may not want that because they like working from home and so on, but the more we can concentrate activity, the more of a chance public transport has got. But yeah, I certainly agree with the hypothesis of the question that you can plan routes, and they should be planned. We did this in Exeter years ago, in Reading, into the construction of new housing estates. If they're built as rabbit warren cul-de-sacs, you could probably permanently say goodbye to any hope of serving those by public transport.
And we probably have. Moving on a little bit into road pricing,
Mhm.
do you think if there was ever road user charging, and thinking back to what you were saying about what politicians find comfortable, would it be more of a hindrance to bus, i.e., single occupancy cars are actually more valuable in pounds, shillings, and pence terms to local and national coffers?
I think it's a very good question. I mean, I'm sort of a market economics type person. I favour things like road pricing. I would also note that the current bias in the tax system towards electric vehicles is going to create a big problem. It's all very well saying, oh well, we spend more, motorists pay more into the road fund than is spent on roads. That's of course true, but that money is being spent on things like care homes and the NHS. So if we diminish that source of income by reducing taxes for electric vehicles, we are going to create an even bigger problem. And public spending in the UK is at very high levels. Taxes are at the highest levels since the war. That's really saying something. The structure is different. We're not at 98% taxes as we were in 1974, but we are at very high aggregate tax burden. And we may be at the point when the goose can't be plucked for any more feathers, in the famous analogy. So what can one do? Something must be done, as I think Lenin or Stalin once said. So what should be done? I think road pricing is one of the things that may have some effect. We know from London, however, that there's been great reluctance of the mayors of both parties to keep raising the congestion charge. Clearly, the congestion charge worked initially, but there was a political unwillingness to raise it to make its effect continuing.
So,
Second problem.
so is that at the bottom of the London problem, actually, that the road too many cars basically now using the network, whatever else is being policy wise?
I don't think so in the case of London, because London is an outlier. There are several problems in London. One is that some of the richest people in Europe live in the congestion charge zone and they get 90% off. The second problem is, relatively to most cities, there aren't any cars in London anyway. Most people were using public transport. The third problem is that there was an unwillingness to extend the times of operation as congestion spread into the evenings and weekends. That's now been resolved by the government ordering TfL. The fourth problem is that TfL was incredibly inefficient at collecting the monies, so the net revenues were not that much. And because TfL, back to my problem of free money, because TfL had so much free money from Her Majesty's Treasury, the net congestion charging income after all the costs of collecting it relative to TfL spending was a relatively trivial amount. So it wasn't mission critical for TfL to get more congestion charge money. The final problem is the change in the traffic composition in central London, huge growth in delivery vans, et cetera, and a big reduction in highway space as they've taken out junction capacity and road space for cycle schemes and other things. So all those things taken together have negated the benefits of the road charging. If you took the road charging out, it would of course be even worse at the margin. But I think that yes, you can't really compare London with even the other large cities. But I think something will have to be done on this, because charging congestion, in my view, is much better than taxing employment. We want to encourage employment and economic growth. We do want to discourage congestion. So it makes sense to tax congestion. But I think it has to be done in a way that the transport authorities get significant net revenues from it. The problem in London is if Philip Hammond or Rishi Sunak is giving you 5 billion a year and you're getting a net 70 or 80 million or something from I mean, the congestion charge, my understanding of the numbers, it's probably only bringing in about a tenth of the bus deficit. We won't even talk about building Crossrail and so on. So the congestion charge upsets a lot of people, potentially upsets a lot more if you spread it into suburban London. But at the current levels of revenue, it doesn't actually generate much of TfL's income. Now, that would be a different economics, but also difficult politics in Brighton or Cambridge.
Yeah, right. David, we better move on to
yes,
the next of your talk.
So next slide here. So something about the political situation, and not party politics particularly, but let's call it transport politics. So Boris Johnson is the most pro bus prime minister probably ever, certainly since Clement Attlee used to commute in by Green Line coach to Downing Street. So we need to ask the question, what happens when he goes? It's quite unlikely that whoever that is will have the same personal interest in buses as Boris Johnson. The second issue is what happens when the money runs out? Now, if we do a good job, if we generate positive social outcomes and good investor returns from running buses, there will be a kind of building snowball of confidence. But if we don't do that, the money will run out and people will start to get bored with buses as a solution to the transport problems. There's also a kind of cultural issue here. The non-Tory parties are far more aligned to urban graduates and public sector employees. These tend to be the people who are less interested in buses and more pro-bike than pro-bus. They're strongly aligned to the cycle lobby. And there's a final risk, which is that we repeat the problems of the 1968 Act. The optimism of Barbara Castle and integrated transport faded very quickly by the mid-1970s because the financial problems of the structures that were created grew so rapidly that we were worried more about the finances than how successful it all was. So if I move on to the next slide, this is W.C. Fields in the 1935 version of David Copperfield, and he is very relevant to our problems. The bus industry, on average, was barely profitable pre-COVID. And this is not what a lot of people in the public sector believe. They think it was some kind of like owning a beefsteak mine. You just had to kind of bank all the enormous dividends. That was not really true, but a lot of people think it's true. And the risk is that costs will end up as 120% of the pre-COVID levels due to congestion, rising unit labour costs, rising fuel costs, these much higher capital costs. And the revenue could be 70% of the pre-COVID level. And the result is misery. And this is not just a problem for commercial bus operators, but also the PTAs. This is the misery that TfL buses are now suffering. And this issue is currently concealed by the DFT support grants, which are paying the bills month to month at the moment. If we move on to the next slide, this maybe looks rather complicated, but the takeaway from this is very simple. Ultimately, there are only two sources of industry income: the passenger paying their fare and the taxpayer. And one of our dangers is that transport operators and the PTAs and the mayors both tend to assume that central government, in the form of Rishi Sunak, will provide bridge funding for their schemes, capital grants or ongoing subsidies. And this may be unrealistic, given the scale of government debt and the commitments to healthcare and social care. We're, for example, seeing this in Scandinavia, where regional government has got to think now about, does it support more bus services, or does it transfer that the tax income at the regional level to the social care sector post-COVID? So there's a question always lurking around, which is what should be the balance between passengers and the taxpayer? And there's a question about incentives. How are operators incentivized? How are local authorities incentivized to deliver good outcomes? Just a final word about loan finance. There's a large amount, we know this from our client base, of private sector capital that would like to invest in green transport projects, including bus projects. But that is money that would need to be repaid. It is not free money that never has to be repaid. This is money that they would like to get their money back. But there is a large pot, and that would smooth and bridge some of the financing problems that I've talked about. So we move on to the next slide, which is the bus lane slide. Ultimately, the only proven way to improve bus outcomes is to ensure fast, reliable bus speeds. We've known this for a long time. There is no new information. Everything else, common branding, smart cards, zero emission buses, these are very much second or third order issues. What I mean is, these are things that might move the dial plus or minus 1 or 2%. Bus priority can move the dial plus or minus tens or even 100%. So many, many times more impact. And places like Dublin and Cambridge and Bristol and so on show what can be done. Now, this also applies to the social outcomes as well as the financial outcomes. In other words, we mustn't delude ourselves that empty buses driving around are somehow generating social benefits. And there are these evil full-up buses that are making big profits for transport operators. The big social benefits are also functions of the number of people on the bus. We must get people on the buses. So buses have to be integrated into LTN and traffic planning, or it's completely fair to do this. We should consciously decide that we don't need as many buses. But I don't think it's realistic in the medium term to ignore the trade-off, as London seeks to do. Next slide, please. So final slide, really. The industry really is at a turning point. The opportunity is very, very large, but there are also very large challenges. And there's also a lot of private capital ready to invest from operators, but also people like banks and infrastructure funds, if the structures are right. Bus speeds are key. I can't overstate that. And the enthusiasm of the current Prime Minister must be grasped and turned into realities that will encourage other politicians to share his enthusiasm. We mustn't assume that Rishi Sunak has unlimited funding. So the prize will go, in my view, to pragmatic operators and authorities who can work together to devise realistic and fundable plans for bus growth. And James, that's all I'd like to say. We can now move on to any further questions.
And thank you very much, David. You've certainly been stirring up our juices. Interesting that the point you've just made picks up on a question that's just landed. So I'm thinking about, it's interesting that it's difficult for some of us to kind of think of Boris as somebody who is a great friend to us, but I take the point that he is at least interested in buses. But there is a lot going on, and the ambitious vision of the national bus strategy, Bus Back Better, is out there for us. How do you think that can be implemented successfully?
I think the key is going to be local partnership working, and I think that this is going to involve quite difficult reorientations on the part of the operators and the local authorities. The operators need to get serious about the role of the local authorities and actually have management structures that can work with the authorities and people who can speak the language of local government and understand what they're trying to do. The local authorities will need to accept, as it were, the difficult economics of all of this. And I think they'll need to work with operators and third-party private sector funders, as well as government, DFT type funding, to come up with funding packages. I suppose the key for me is to have very clear views about what the objectives actually are. If you have clear views about the objectives and the weighting between the objectives, are we worried more about decongestion or economic growth or social inclusion and so on, we can then start to devise plans that meet those objectives. But I think we have to the great enemy will be woolly thinking. And woolly thinking is the kind of general sense that we just do things that sound like they're a good idea without sort of subjecting them to rigorous financial and economic analysis. I mean, what I mean by that is the question really ought to be, okay, how much, say, decongestion do I get per pound that I spend? If I was Bristol City Council, what can I do? What's the range of interventions I can make? And I would then rank them on the, decongestion per pound spent, economic growth per pound spent. And I would concentrate, as it were, on the things that give me the biggest bangs per buck. I then have to think, how am I going to finance this? How much is coming from my money, Rishi Sunak, the bus operator, an infrastructure fund, and how can I kind of get all the ducks in a row and lever the money in the right way? So I think there are very big benefits for the local authorities and the bus operators, but it's going to require a much more intensive and probably kind of mathematical level of co-working than the sort of just going along with the poor box, rattling it outside the DFT and hoping that they'll give you some money for some vaguely good idea.
And I suppose that takes us to the enhanced partnership, specifically as being a mechanism for bringing all this together. Do you think that's going to work? And will there be good ones, or what do you think?
I think there can be good ones, but I think that they're going to depend a great deal on the way that the operators and the authorities work together. I mean, Brighton, for example, isn't technically an enhanced partnership, but it's delivered over a long period of time, more than 20 years, large cumulative growth. But there are sort of formal partnerships which didn't deliver growth. And as I mentioned, they're not new. I mean, these things existed in many British towns from the 1930s through to the 1980s. I think the key is around incentives, by which I mean what's in it for the local authority and what's in it for the bus operator. The bus operators are going to have to accept that they share some of the financial upside with the authorities. The authorities will need to understand that the bus operators potentially have very large capital and non-capital expenditures that they'll need to fund. I mentioned that as a simple rule of thumb, the move to electric vehicles up front will be 2 to 3 times current levels of capex. And pre-COVID, many of the bus operators were struggling to replace their diesel buses, let alone that kind of level of spending. So they can deliver, and I think that, you know, one of the kind of, where could they work? I'll just answer it the opposite way around, where they would not work. There will be many towns now where the level of residual demand is too low for passenger revenue and passenger related subsidies to exceed costs. And in those places, the ball is now in the court of the local authorities. There will be other places where if you get the magic formula, which is bus priority, improved customer service, marketing, all the other things I mentioned, then the market will grow potentially quite a lot. And there will be spoils that can be divided between the shareholders, who need to be rewarded for their risk and investment, and the local authorities, who need to be rewarded for enabling the growth. So I think they are potentially very exciting, but they do require a lot of, you know, intellectual rigor and mathematical homework. But I think it will be well worth doing that. And I think also there's a kind of element of Usain Bolt about this, by which I mean the fastest people will be the winners. If I was a local authority or a bus operator, I would be trying to get my nose in the trough with a well thought out plan, while others stick their finger up their fundament and think about it. And, you know, there will be an element, it won't be just the most virtuous places, it will be the fastest places who come up with good, well thought through plans. They will barge their way to the head of the queue. And as a pushy sort of person, I would be barging my way to the front of the queue, but with a rigorously worked out plan.
And picking up on that, there's a comment in the chat as follows. The final comment hits the nail on the head. Pragmatic public-private sector partnerships built around bus priority and delivering commercially fundable networks is the way forward. So where does active travel fit into that?
I think it's part of it, but I think I'll repeat the sort of earlier comment about trade-offs. If you were to go around, as I live in the central London, I travel for a lot in London, you can quite clearly see the observed allocation of scarce road space in many parts of London is you would observe that the buses are a lower priority than the pedestrian and cycle ways. And that is not to say that I'm proposing no cycle or pedestrian priority, but you know the same points about the scarcity of money apply to the scarcity of road space. So somebody has to say, well, what weight do we place? How can we use these scarce few square meters of road space? Do we allocate some of that for buses and try and get lots of people on the buses so we can move large numbers of people through, and probably, you know, take action like road pricing to push more of the remaining cars out of the way? Or do we simply say, no, our priority is cycling? The consequence of that is the buses will go very slowly. There won't be very many of them. They will mainly be there for, you know, old gentlemen and old ladies who don't want to cycle or can't cycle, or it's too rainy or whatever the answer is. And we consciously decide to subordinate those. All of those things are viable. I would contend that in many parts of London, there needs to be a bit more weighting towards the buses or the removal of the buses, and a bit more honesty about the political desire to make the cars, you know, disappear, and you know, to get that balance right. But I think that, you know, all of these bus journeys ultimately end in a pedestrian journey, and we need to sort of integrate the buses into that, and not think about the buses as some kind of you know, encumbrance to my neighbours here at Canary Wharf, who are sort of zooming down the road in their very expensive bikes. We are in danger of doing Robin Hood in reverse, where we tax poor people in Hartlepool so that people who live in St John's Wood can cycle into Goldman Sachs on very expensive bikes. And there are all sorts of complicated, you know, distribution effects of that.
Right. Now, there's tremendous amount of useful stuff going through the chat, but it's obvious also that people are starting to drop out of the meeting. So we've got to the moment at the end of the session where it's just my great pleasure, really, to say a huge thank you very much indeed to you, David, for providing us with a thoroughly thought-provoking presentation that starts off our BRT UK series of lunchtime masterclasses with great verve. Thank you to everybody who's patiently sat in at the beginning until 12:45. I'm really sorry for the delay in starting, all technical, but we'll learn some lessons of that, I'm quite sure. But don't forget that this is the first of 6 sessions. They're every Thursday, 12:30 for 60 minutes. Go to Transport Extra to register for the upcoming sessions. And one other thing to say to you is next spring, BRT UK, in association with Landor, hopes, well, we're hoping very much to bring you a fully fledged conference in person on Merseyside, 16th, 17th of March, if those dates work, all being well. But watch for details. So with many thanks to you for listening, to David for not only putting up with and recovering from all the delays at the front end of this session, and to Juliana and Mark in the background who've been struggling to make this work and ultimately successfully. To all of you, thank you very much indeed. And this is James Freeman signing off, and goodbye to you all.